Okay, back to continue the introduction to the channel, the story you find yourself in. We're getting into part 4. It's going to be 2 videos. It's the ending. We focused on the beginning, and I want to circle back to a couple of those items before we move on. You know, there are 2 major doctrinal shifts that have been presented, and getting back to the Canaanites and the God of the Old Testament. And he says, you got to kill them all. And that's just symbolic. It signifies the need to look for those nations within us that are creating those error thoughts, and you can't serve 2 masters. It's like that parable of the mustard seed. It cuts both ways. If you allow and invite and you try to mesh and coexist with the higher and lower self, it's just not going to work. And so you've got to carry it all the way through. And then that also reconciles the angry God of the Old Testament. It's symbolic language that says you've got to go in and take care of that. Then back to Adam and Eve, we've decided, I'm presenting. Eve is the subconscious, that's our creative power within us. All thoughts move up through the heart center, and that's what the subconscious Eve represents is the heart center, the seat of the subconscious. And Adam is consciousness that starts out this journey unconscious. You're not aware of your spiritual nature. And I think going back to, I think it's Genesis 2:24 is, you got to leave your father and your mother, then become husband and wife, and become one flesh. And I think that's symbolic of us, before we incarnate, we're in spirit, wherever that resides, and we're with our father and our mother symbolically there, and we have to leave the comforts of whatever that place is and physically incarnate. So we have to leave that father-mother environment, and you come down here and have this physical incarnation. And I kind of look at father as spirit, mother as matter. And for matter to manifest into a created thing that we live on and our bodies are, that spirit manifests in matter and turns it into a physical creation. And that kind of gets back to, this isn't specifically referencing the Father God, but it's his father and mother. And I kind of look at it as that's Christ and Mary. And you get back to the Bible and you take a look at the nature of that relationship, it continues. And so with that said, I want to get back to the meaning of Nakash and Meshiach before we move on. Because, the key point here is the Messiah. And that's where the Old Testament leads us to. And it says, you know what? You're not going to make it out of Egypt, capture the promised land, and keep it without the Messiah. And the Messiah is the key. What or who is it? And it's the one thing that really can reconcile all religions into this one singular truth. And that's kind of where I'm going with this. I say in my book, I think we all know that there is a single truth that connects us all and bridges all religions and all practices of spirituality or pursuits of spirituality. It's just what is it? We got so many variations. I mean, Christianity has over 35,000 denominations in and of itself. And there's a lot of division, a lot of difference of opinion and interpretation. And that's even within a single religion. But Nakash in Hebrew means the shining one. It's not serpent. But we've moved to that serpent because in Eastern philosophies, that serpent represents the life energy of us in a physical earthly manifestation. It's also appropriate the way that it sheds its skin and morphs into a variety of personas to stay one step ahead of us as we work on our involvement. And going back to the goat and the sheep, goat and the ram, in Daniel, it's in chapter 8, it's that vision. The goat represents Greece, and the ram represents Media Persia. When you look at the sequence of events of Jerusalem being under captivity, it went from Babylon to to Persia, Old Testament ends. And then you have Greece conquered Persia to control Jerusalem. And that basically is a portend to say that goat persona has already anticipated, he's one step ahead of you, and as you move through the Media Persia phase, it's taking on that next heightened persona, and it's got you trapped, and it just slams you, and you didn't see it coming. And really, none of us are prepared for that, but that's what I think the Bible's showing us in that regard. And then Messiah, Meshiach, is the anointed one. So, that's a lot different than Savior and other words that have been applied to it, but it is the anointed one, and that's important, and we're gonna get to that. And then as the the journey ends in the Bible for the Israelites, they're in Persia. King Cyrus has allowed them to come back in and rebuild the temple. And then later, Nehemiah rebuilds the wall, and we're going to revisit that a little bit later too. There's a really cool story there. And then you go through the, got the 5 major prophets, and then you got the 12 minor prophets. And once you see this imagery that is presented in the book, and once again, this is the book that I'm introducing. This is the purpose of this channel, from Genesis to Revelation, a story you find yourself in. That is, as this progresses, we see what those prophets are foretelling, and every one of those goes back to the same imagery, and it really is a focus on the heart center. With Jerusalem being the heart center, the promised land, and our goal is to have a new Jerusalem, and that's what we have at the end of Revelation. But that heart center goes through various phases, and the main and primary one is the captivity of Babylon, because they came in and they destroyed the temple, and they tore down the walls and just decimated it. And that really is featured prominently in the book of Revelation as well. And then you have that progression of personas of that serpent. It starts off as Pharaoh, and that's Egypt. That's that first center, that first spiritual center. And then you move into Babylon, and then Babylon is Jezebel and Ahab. And then towards the end of Babylon and the beginning of Persia, you have the king of Tyre. And it's interesting, he had a massively fortified city off, kind of in an island state. And he was just sitting there fat and happy. You couldn't get to him. And that's kind of typical of that part of our persona. And then Old Testament ends, and then you start the New Testament. And the first person you see really is Herod, the king of Jews, and baby Jesus, he wants to kill him. And so that last phase is the Roman, when Rome conquered Jerusalem by taking out Greece. And throughout the rest of the Bible narrative, it's Rome is that persona. And I think the book of Revelation, even though Herod is the king of Jews and he represents that personal ego part of it, I think Revelation has basically expanded that concept into Rome in general with Caesar Nero. And we were going to see, the number of the beast is 666, and that's the number of the name Caesar Nero, and that's what it's pointing to. But when you see that, think about Herod too. Think about Herod, the king of Jews. He was a Jewish Roman, and he was an Edomite, a descendant from Esau. So you have, back in the day, I've seen a lot of commentary where they connect Ishmael with the religion of Islam, and they connect Esau, Edomites, through Herod to be in their religion is Christianity. So you got Christianity aligned with the Edomites, Esau, and Islam with Ishmael. And then then it's no surprise that kind of the mid-centuries we had these wars between it's the Crusades. We had these wars between Christianity and Islam. So I mean it connects up like that. And looking at in Daniel, there's 3 beasts, and we've mentioned the lion, we mentioned the bear. Well, the third one is the leopard, and it had 4 heads. And that's the part of our bodies, the center of our personality, ego, power. And we'll see in Revelations, they say that's where Satan dwells. So that's where Satan lives in us, that serpent persona. And the 4 heads, I believe, represent one of 2 things: dominion and control of those first 4 spiritual centers, and or the persona of each of the serpent personas that he has. It's Pharaoh, Jezebel, Ahab, King of Tyre, and Herod. And so we started off in the Old Testament. We nailed down 2 major doctrinal departures that I take from the way it's been presented historically in mainstream practice. And I really can't get started on Revelation until I lay out maybe some of the other doctrinal departures that I take, because, and there's roughly 10 or 11, that you have to see their construct in the esoteric in order for Revelations to jive. And when you see these doctrines presented that way, they match up perfectly. And so if I can explain them before I get there, then we can just run through Revelation and you can see how these pieces slot in. But we can't talk about any of this without talking about the concept of cognitive dissonance. And I think we're hearing more and more about that, but it is kind of the classic element of that narcissist codependent relationship. There's a cognitive dissonance that develops, and there's just a variety of techniques: triangulation, gaslighting, projection, dog whistling, love bombing, removing autonomy, ghosting, smear campaigns, and the like. And one of the big things that's going on right now, and I'm seeing it on a number of YouTube channels, is this focus on the second coming and how that's created cognitive dissonance within the Christian community, because every generation thinks it's now, and they can see all the ingredients for this event to be brewing up and taking place. And so there's a lot of focus on it, and because that's what is believed, it's actually something that that community is looking, that ideology is looking forward to. They want it to happen. It's going to validate what they believe. And even though it hasn't happened, and they continue to believe it and rationalize it, it's something that creates that cognitive dissonance. And all these doctrines that I'm going to go through, and they stack them up, creates that cognitive dissonance, that relationship between the individual and the institution. And I personally think it's by design, but that doesn't really matter. It's just happening. But this cognitive dissonance related to the second coming is really from a misunderstanding of what the second coming is. And so we really need to move towards that and nail it down for purposes of understanding what's going on in Revelation, because it says over and over, the day of the Lord is near. It's now. And the book of Revelation in 2 places says, hey, the time is near. He that hears, he needs to hear this. It's at hand. And it's been at hand since the resurrection of Jesus. And that's why Jesus says, hey, it can happen for you at any moment. You just have to understand what it is you're looking for. And then you got to go in and try to find it. But us as humans, we have this propensity to attach to ideologies. And with an attachment, there's expectations. And you can look at almost any relationships and say, you know what, conditional love has expectations. And and that comes with attachments that you're always wanting what's expected. Well, when you don't get what's expected, then rather than really understanding the cause, that just generates that unmet expectation generates another choice. And so that next choice isn't really motivated on what the original need or thought was. It's now you've created a more complex thought process by reacting to an unmet expectation. And that's typically what happens. There's a reaction. Rather than to really think it through, you got to go back to the root and analyze, was it a reasonable expectation in the first place? And we just very seldom don't do that. But looking at just the whole concept of governments and political machines, totalitarianism is a ideology built around cognitive dissonance. And you have the state that creates a problem, and they're the only ones that can fix it. And so you rely on them for safety and security, and you see it, and they're lying back at you for why it happened, but you know why it happened. You saw it, you experienced it, and so you're living in this cognitive dissonance. And if it happens to you enough, you start having to pick a lane and pick a side, and it's on an unsound foundation. And that just doesn't work in your head. You feel it subconsciously, and it's hard to cognitively see it and then do something about it. That's why we always have to be challenging what we believe, because initially everything that we did adopt was done unconsciously. It was done in an environment based on the environment that you've been pressed into. So with that, let's take a look at these doctrines that we have to zip through here. The starters the biggest is Jesus is God, the Trinity. And I can't tell you the number of videos I've watched of the Trinitarians and the non-Trinitarians debating this, and it's maddening. And there's a good YouTube out there. The guy does a great job. It's called The Trinity Delusion. And he just pounds it. But that argument that Jesus is God has always fallen flat with me. And now I understand better why that's so. And the esoteric rationale, the integrity of the connections, they break down pretty quick when you put Jesus up there as God and not Jesus as a man. And we can beat on this forever, right? There's hours and years and decades spent debating this. But I just look at it, when you look at the Bible esoterically and symbolically, when Jesus is used singularly, it means it has a certain context. It even changes slightly when it's Jesus, the Son of Man. And then you have Christ, and Christ used singularly is an independent entity. And then you got Jesus Christ, and you have a whole other thing. And it has its own significance. Then of course you have Father God, but when it comes to Jesus and Christ is not Jesus' last name. And when you see Christ written in the Bible, if you're automatically inferring that's talking about Jesus, then you missed it. And there's a lot of times when they're talking about Jesus, and then there's a he or a him on the back side of it. Almost in every case in my Bible, it's capitalized. But you go to the original Greek, and it's very seldom are you going to see that. It's the lowercase. Now, when it's talking about Christ, and the he and the him, it's always capitalized, and it's capitalized in the Greek. So the Greek's making a distinction, and so I think we need to pay attention to that. But right out of the bat, I'm just saying, I can't make the esoteric work with Jesus being God. And I think the story's just so much deeper and richer when he's not. And when he's God, you're looking out there at him saying, man, he said to be perfect like I'm perfect. How am I going to do that? And then if he's out there, then Satan's got to be out there too. But as we've already discussed, the big departures in the Old Testament is that Christ is in us, the serpent's in us, two sides of the same coin. And my visual of that is we're in this serpent persona until we're not. And we'll see, as we get through the rest of it, if you can see it, then you're going to burn it up. But there comes that point where, and it happens in an instant, where the coin just flips. Now we're seeing the shining one, to the anointed. It's two sides of the same coin of Christ, these two pieces that are divine and they're in us, they're part of our construction, and we got to have it. And so that's my basic position. If you, and I'm just going to read a verse, where I think it just puts it out there, front and center. And it's chapter 5 of Hebrews, and it's titled "The Perfect High Priest," and it starts off in there. It says, "Hey, awake, O sleeper, rise from the dead." So, right away in the context, he's approaching someone that, look, you're not awake, and you need to wake up. Wait a minute, no, that's it. Well, I'm going to go back to chapter 3. I mean, that's an important, I was going to go there next, but chapter 3, it says, "Therefore, holy brethren," the first verse, "Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession." So he's apostle and high priest. "He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses was also in his house." So Jesus was appointed by Christ, and Jesus was faithful. And I kind of look at that process of going back into Egypt. All the great men in the Bible went back to Egypt before they could come out of Egypt, and they all did it as grown men. Well, Jesus is the only one that did it as a child. And so when Jesus went down into Egypt, he was a child undefiled, and that gets back to you look at those nursing babies. They're gonna be like them to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, Jesus went into Egypt as a child undefiled, and so he comes out of Egypt, and so you can look at Jesus and say, well, he's never been defiled. He came into being conscious. And, I kind of look at that and say, well, the book of Job, it says the Lord's up there with the sons of God. And there has to be, Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. And so he was already a son of God in the heavens with our Father. And Christ said, you're going to be the guy that's going to go down there. And and I've seen a lot of things written that Jesus was maybe the first Adam, and he's also the last Adam. But he comes as a man. He manifests as a son of God already, fully awake, conscious, and his drive, his goal, his mission was to show us the way and to show us the significance of Christ. And Christ is the Son of God, and that's spirit. And I kind of look at the Christ being that component of God that led the creation of this environment that we're in. And it gets back to Christ and Mary, Christ and matter. That to make this planet, to make this whole ecosystem, to make us, you had to have a combination of matter comes into existence physically because of spirit. I don't know. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with me. So going back to Jesus is Gospel of Thomas, verse 61, and he just comes out and says, I'm your disciple. And so that's just a statement that he made. And But I look at Jesus as the appointed one. He was faithful. Jesus means one thing. Jesus, Son of Man, means a little bit something different. Christ means something. Jesus Christ is something different, and so on. Okay, I'm going to go over here to Ephesians 5. That's where I'm going next. That's where I had my Bible open, but kind of got distracted. So, looking at Ephesians chapter 5, in that beginning narrative, it says, hey, awake, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. So, he's talking in this context. And then he gets into this, that marriage is like Christ and the church. And this is a concept that it's key to what we're doing. And, mainstream Christianity says, that's about the husband and the wife. And that's where it says, hey, the woman, you should be subject to your husband in all matters. And it kind of compares the husband and wife to the church and the body. Christ in the church. Christ in the church. Well, symbolically, the church is representative of our bodies. And at first, we're the body tabernacle. As we travel, we do the caterpillar crawl, we're the body tabernacle. And then our goal is to become butterflies, which is we have the body temple. And so here it's, Christ in the church is the Christ in us, Christ in our body. Well, within our body, we have the husband and the wife. We have Adam and Eve. And so the reference here, esoterically, is the relationship between the Adam and the Eve in us. At this point, it's the unconscious consciousness and Eve under the influence of the serpent persona. So then you have some dialogue here talking about, hey, well, this relationship's got to be reconciled into this, blameless, pristine wife, and that she can be presented. And so that's when the two become one. But prior to that, you have a situation where Eve is not a widow, but she's having a relationship with the serpent. So you have the concept of adultery. And when you see this imagery and you go back and read the Bible, almost all of it, the adultery is pointing to this situation where your heart center is having this conflicted relationship with that serpent persona. And in Adam, she yearns for her husband, but he's just not there. And so she's being corrupted, really unwillingly, but still corrupted. So I depart on what the now you could probably apply some of those verses to the actual relationship between a married couple. But when you look at the extremes of the language, I think it's been misconstrued and it's been a harmful philosophy overall. And then during this dialogue, it also refers back to the same verse. For this reason, you'll leave your father and your mother, and you will become husband and wife. Which that's Genesis 2:24, and so it tells you that what they're talking about here is the same thing they're talking about in Genesis. And then Paul goes on to say, this mystery is great. And I think it's the great mystery that Paul, people attribute to Paul. This is the answer. This is what's going on. Okay, the third one is the second coming of Christ. Right now, Judaism's looking for the Messiah. Won't get into that. Most of you probably know what the expectations are. Christianity is looking for the Messiah, which is Jesus, but he's not here, and he's going to come back. And he's going to come down in the clouds, and people are going to be raptured and go on up. And that's what everybody's been expecting. Hundreds of books. It's probably preached on more than anything else, and it's all fear-based. And Revelation in this other context, it's not that at all. So I'm saying the second coming is what happens in us. It's available to each one of us right now. And time is near. The day of the Lord is there waiting for you. You just have to go in and make it happen. Now I will say here that looking at that apocalyptic event, I mean, we're powerful beings, and thoughts create. That's the creating energy behind everything you see out there. It's an impulse, a thought to action. And we're told that watch your thoughts because they run your life, and that's true. And in an unregenerate heart, you don't have the wall around your heart, and so your body, these impulses that are happening all over you, and they come into your heart center and they turn into a thought. And without discipline, without intention, you could react, make a choice, and not even be aware of it, and it just sets off a little story of its own, and you may or may not be aware of it. It may end up causing you pleasure, and it may be good, or it very well could be something that causes you pain, and it unknowingly and unexpectedly, it sets in motion something that is not good for you. So that's that. And then the next one is the Antichrist. So right now you have in the apocalyptic literature, standard accepted doctrine that the Antichrist shows up in the book of Revelation, and he's the one that creates all this havoc, the one world government and what have you. And I can say the collective unconscious, because there's so much energy being focused to this outcome, it just has to happen because of this cognitive dissonance, that we're going to create some form of that kind of an event. We're going to create some form of one world government, and we're probably going to have, some really bad things happen because we want them to happen. We have to have those things happen. So we are going to will it into existence. I'm suggesting that if we were to back up and take a different look at this and see how, what the Messiah really means, and if all the religions in the world were to take that position, there'd be immediate reconciliation. Because the problem between Judaism and Christianity is the Messiah. What is the Messiah? And the Messiah in this context applies to Judaism just the same way as it does Christianity. And the way that the New Testament syncs up esoterically with the Old Testament, to me it's clear it was a book intended for the extension of that religion of Judaism. It's just when Christianity took Jesus and held him up to be God, he's almost like he was hijacked, and Judaism no way could accept that. And you go back in the day when that happened, the government of Rome and the church were one and the same, and they were intertwined, completely. And back in the day, the emperors put themselves up to be God, and they did that for political reasons. You can manipulate your population and control them through, once again, cognitive dissonance. How I'm believing this guy's God, but man, he's a God just like me. What makes him God? But preceding that was Greece, and Greece conquered Jerusalem before that, and Greece kind of represents that intellect and undisciplined thought. All the multiple gods and how they looked at the creation and said, okay, where are the gods here? And so Rome comes in, and they start holding up their emperors to be God. And so this whole concept of God back in the day isn't what it is today. And they did the switch when they made, they had the Nicene Council back in 325, and then later on they made the decision to make it the state religion. And when they did that, they did the switch and said, we'll no longer consider the emperor's God, but we're gonna impart that onto Jesus and in our religion. And because they were intertwined, and structural wise, the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church looks very much like a totalitarianism, construct, institution. And there's that same cognitive dissonance that comes into play. And then you had the Roman government wanting to do the same thing. Man, they wanted to control the world. And so now we fast forward and we're looking at Revelation and saying, hey, we're fearful of this one world government. This is going to be terrible, but we have to have it. We want it. It's going to validate what we believe. And it's just an ironic, mind to have. And it's really probably worth, if you don't understand what cognitive dissonance is, I'm not going to explain it. I'm already 35 minutes into this. So that's the next one. And then the fifth one is the crucifixion and the resurrection. I don't really have to say if I believe it really happened or not. And because when you look at it esoterically, it's signifying what's happening inside of you. And once again, Jesus descended into the lower parts of the earth. He went into Egypt. We all do that. We have to go into Egypt to then resurrect our authentic self, the two into one. And we crucify that false persona, the false prophet, and it's the image for an image. And we start off in that false persona, the false serpent persona, and we believe that to be us. And in the process, we have to see it first. But in the process of kicking that guy out, you're not really kicking him out. You're taking his master capacity away and you're making him a servant. And that gets back to Cain. Hey, everybody finds me, they're going to kill me. And God said, no, they're not going to kill you, but you're going to flip. You're going to be the servant rather than the master. And that's kind of that dialogue when each of those progeny, Cain and Abel and Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau, is one will serve the other, and the first will be last and the last will be first, and that's what all that means. And so the crucifixion and resurrection is something that we do. We go to the cross of duality. Our experience is duality, and we put to death our duality experience, and we move into non-duality. So unity consciousness to fragmented consciousness, duality to non-duality. And I believe that's represented by the cross, that we put ourselves on the cross of duality and we end that experience. The number 6 is Satan, devil, Lucifer, and the serpent. That's the internal adversary. And all the language, back practice of Judaism and the Old Testament, and any example you see of Satan pop up in the Old Testament, it's, that word means adversary, hasatan, and it's not intended to represent an outside third party, deity of sorts. And so, once again, big departure. The concept of blindness and nakedness, it really is important to get this. And we've talked about nakedness. Adam and Eve at first, they were naked and unashamed. So they knew they were naked, but they were still in unity consciousness, so there's no reason to be ashamed. The Gospel of Thomas says later, hey, if you can take off your clothes and stomp on them like a little baby and not be ashamed, then you got the kingdom of heaven. That means you're one. You're back into one. But if you're naked and unaware of your nakedness, it is to your shame. It says that in a number of places in the Bible. So that's basically saying if you're moving around in the natural body mode and you're totally oblivious to that nature between Adam and Eve and your consciousness, it is to your shame. And in that condition, you need to get your clothes on. You need to start doing some work and putting on some garments. Initially, they're going to be soiled. They're not going to be so pretty. But when you're fully Christed, they're going to be white. And so we're clothed in Christ. Our nakedness is covered up by Christ. And so that's what that means. Now, blindness is very similar. Blind, open your eyes so you can see, and there's a lot of imagery in Revelation about things opening and seeing. And in the book of Job, he says, hey, I heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eye, singular. And that's very important because it denotes a specific moment, and we're going to see that in Revelation. And it's called the third eye. It's an internal eye. And when you're in meditation, that's kind of how you're watching what's going on, and you're in a deep meditation. It does look cloudy, and there's lights, and that's where God comes down in. See, and that's where you commune with God, and you see Him in the clouds. It really is a spiritual experience, and there's no particular shape or anything, but that's kind of what you're seeing when you're at least for me. Blindness, it's a little different. And if we go to the parables of the blind man, you basically have two. You have the one that was blind from birth, and then the one where Jesus says, hey, if you say we see, then you need to become blind again in order to progress towards the kingdom of heaven. And it really doesn't have anything to do with physically seeing out of your eyes. It's the man blind from birth he was born in the natural body mode, which we all start out, other than I think Jesus. I think Jesus came fully conscious, a son of God that said, hey, Christ, if you want me to come back, I'll do it. And I kind of think Jesus probably was the firstborn. He was probably the Adam, and somewhere else in that progression, he probably was the first Son of God, the first of many brethren, and we're all intended to be brethren of Jesus. Christ's Spirit is the only begotten Son of God, and that is the anointed one. The Messiah is Christ. But blindness, the man blind from birth, Jesus said, hey, well, the Pharisees were saying, they brought him to him, and Jesus mixed up some water and some clay, and he put it on his eyes, and then when he went to wash it off, he could see. And Jesus said, who do you say the Son of Man is? And the guy said, well, I don't really know, but you're really something special, right? And he goes, well, you're looking at him, and both of you have seen me. And this is really a fairly controversial verse, or it's a mistranslated verse. In most translations, it says, and you have seen me. Well, the original Greek says, both of you have seen me, and the both is capped and the you is capped. And what that's saying in that moment, that his eyes were open, is when he saw both of his images. The false prophet image and his authentic. That's the inauthentic. And he saw the authentic image of himself, where the two become one. There's still, right in that moment, it shows that there's still other things that are going to play out, but I'll show you in Revelation where that moment occurs in chapter 11, where the heavens open and the Ark of the Covenant, the temple opens and the Ark of the Covenant appears, and immediately after that, the woman gives birth, and Satan's cast out of heaven, out of his pretentious spot in heaven, as him playing God of your life. And I will say right now, in case I don't fix it later, earlier I said the woman was sitting on the sun and had her moon as a footstool. What it really says is that she was clothed in the sun. She was clothed in the Spirit, divine love, unconditional love, and the moon was under her feet, which means she had dominion over the intellect. It's always the battle between the heart and the head, and as long as the head's your master, you're in the natural body. When you move to the spiritual body, you're living from the heart. And that's, lighten the eyes of my heart, O Lord. It's salvation is enlightenment. It's awakening. And so, but then the very next thing that happened is the Pharisees were like, they weren't getting it, and Jesus says, well, if you say we see, you say that you see, but you're really not awake, then you need to become blind again. Continue on your path. You've been deceived. You've been deceived in your spirituality to say that you see the right way and that you're there. And you've got to become blind again. You've got to recognize your nakedness so that you can continue. And you should be shamed when you realize that you're naked and we're unaware of it, because it is to your shame. And when you realize it, you're like, whoa, okay, I need to fix this. And you're going to see references to this nakedness language in the book of Revelation. And that gets me to Paul, because Paul had his miraculous conversion on the road to Damascus. And he's on a horse, and he sees a bright light, falls off his horse, and he's blinded. He's blind for 3 days. And after 3 days, the scales fell from his eyes, and when the scales fell from his eyes, he could see. So that's when he basically was converted from 2 into 1. You know, and he was the quintessential, right? He was the Pharisee, member of the Sanhedrin, one of the most powerful guys in his space. I mean, he was definitely a dude, and persecuted the Christians. And after this event, he goes off for 3 years, and that's presumably the dark night of the soul, the reorientation. It's taken me probably 3 years, to get a grip. And he comes back, and people don't recognize him. They say, "Man, who is this guy? Weren't you the guy that did all these bad things, and now you're coming here and you've totally flipped sides? What gives?" And he had a lot of issues with that. People just didn't trust him. So, but here's the real key. When this hit me, I just said, "Wow, it was just kind of an aha moment." When the scales represent the Leviathan, the scales of Leviathan, that persona falling away, and that has to happen before you can see. That's like seeing the other side of the other image. But that Leviathan serpent persona fell away, and he was able to see. Then the next one, it's number 8. It's the behemoth and the Leviathan. I think mainstream interpretations, they try to pin that on an actual physical creature, and it just doesn't work. But the behemoth is described in chapter 40, I think, of Job. That he lies under the lotus plants, covert in the reeds of the lotus plants, and he's in the shade, and he eats grass. Now, eating grass is going to be important when we get to the events of Revelation, but it also kind of goes hand in hand. The behemoth is really the goat persona, just in a different context, because it's the shaggy goat, and it was big, and so hence the behemoth, which is our unconscious consciousness. It's Adam. I attribute Adam to behemoth. Then I also attribute that part of us as that thinker, the thinker part of us. Then you got Eve, the Leviathan is the beast of the seas. And when it comes out in Revelation as the beast of the sea, it's a conglomeration of the first 4 beasts found in the vision of Daniel in chapter 7. And they all have certain personas and personalities. So it's not a physical creature, at least not esoterically. Then in Revelation, the 7 spirits before the thrones, they are the lampstands, and they are the churches, and we'll show you that. But that's also saying that there are 7 major nerve gatherings, ganglion boxes of nerves with lots of energy that independently create impulses, causing thoughts, based on where they're coming from. and the whole body is the mind. And you really would be helpful to start looking at your whole body as this thing holding this soul, and in this intricately made machine that we got, generates energy and impulses all over. And then the framework for forgiveness, I'm advocating it's baked into this program that we're in. And when you take a look at the grace of God, it's while we're in this natural body mode, we're expected that bad things are going to happen, and we're going to do some stupid things. We're going to do sinful things. And it's part of the journey. It's part of the intent. And so when you are saved through salvation, and like you do wake up, that grace of God covers you. You're forgiven because it was by design. And when you look at the accounts of forgiveness, Jesus always said that you are forgiven or you have been forgiven. Not once does Jesus say, I forgive you. And it's not his place to forgive. It's baked into the machinery. And the one time that he had the opportunity to actually forgive proactively was on the cross. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so those are the folks that say we see, but they're still blind. They're naked. They're still naked. And they're unaware of it. And Jesus says, he reached out to the Father and said, Father, this is the one time I'm asking you to depart from the baked in forgiveness rules, that they are forgiven or have been forgiven. Because what it says in that account of the blind, he said, if you say we see and you're still naked, then your sin is attributable to you. You don't have the benefit of the grace of God in that scenario, but that's baked into the program. Heaven and hell. I think spirit incarnating into this natural physical experience, starting off in the natural body mode, that's hell. And I do want to go to a verse in the Gospel of Thomas, and it's verse 84. And it says, this is really a cool verse. It says, Jesus said, when you see your likeness, you are happy. But when you see your images that came into being before you, and that neither die nor become visible, how much will you have to bear? So looking at that, you see your image. Your images that were before you, they're you. And I kind of look at that as kind of a lake of fire. Is, if you weren't saved and you didn't wake up, and you die physically, then you have the great white throne of judgment, and you're sitting there, and you're watching you in this incarnation missing it again, and knowing that you got tripped up somewhere, you got sucked into an ideology, or you just missed it, and you got to do it again. Based on what I've gone through, I don't really see that I want to come back, unless there's some sort of a special designation, perhaps like Jesus, come back conscious and not have to go through that struggle again, and fear that you're going to miss it. Because I can't imagine the number of times that's probably happened before. Because this journey, I just don't see how it can happen in a single lifetime. So there I go. That's the next one, reincarnation. And I think there's a whole lot more that supports reincarnation in the Bible than not. It certainly is a component of Eastern religions and Buddhism and what have you. What they're missing is the Messiah. And not believing that there's a higher power, there's just no other way to kick that guy out of heaven, kick that false prophet off the throne. because it's always one step ahead of you, and you're negotiating with the very thing that you're trying to subdue. And the only way that coin flips is you got to acknowledge Christ so you can see Christ. And so I think that's enough with that introduction. Well, no, I have another that I want to talk about. Sorry about that. But this really, the C is the subconscious. And we talked about it, so Earth is consciousness, the C is subconsciousness. And we're going to see in the book of Revelation, well, there's a lot of references to C, and Ezekiel 28, the narrative about the king of Tyre, that's a great place to go to see how the sea is roped into it, because he's in the heart of the seas. That's the heart of the subconscious here, And then there's several references to seeing that, when those that just simply see you, it'll be fire that's going to burn you to ashes. And that's that concept of seeing that part of you. You're in meditation, you're just observing your subconscious, and in the process of just observing, it just dissolves. It just bleeds away. And because you've done the hard part, you flip the coin. And that is the end of this part 1 of part 4, the ending. And so the next video, I'm going to walk you through the entire book of Revelation. And we should be able to do that. It's going to take a little while, but we're not going to get hung up too much. But hey, thanks so much for watching. I hope this helps.